Roger asked me to preach today, and of course he did it on the day that we have daylight savings time change, which typically in church life is typically a low Sunday. You know, it's but you guys must be a different breed here, because you're on time and on task. And what's that? Stalwarts, absolutely. You know, and it occurred to me as I always prepare for these things here at this church that Roger set the bar so high that I feel like I'm pretty short when it comes to trying to achieve what he does on a regular basis. And I'm also convicted of the reality that I don't do this every week, so it does change the way. And I'm also convinced that the wonderful blessing that we have, I think 7 ministers in this congregation, there's an awful lot of empathy out there, right? And a lot of understanding. Well, a little bit about our passage today, a little bit of historical context before I begin the wisdom lesson. The Gospel of John was written in or around or during the years 90 to 120 AD. This was right after or during the reigns of some of the most notorious Roman rulers: Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. And these are really bad people. These were sick individuals by pretty much all standards. They were sadistic and in some cases very, very cruel. Christianity was forced to become an underground movement during these years. During this time, between 90 and 120, Christianity was often viewed as being part of Judaism, and yet it was universally regarded as a heretical sect by the Jews. Importantly, at least in the eyes of the Roman rulers, Christianity was viewed as a threat to the Roman government and Roman society. History is replete with stories of early Christians being tortured, thrown to the lions for sport, and crucified. More than likely, by the time that this gospel was written, early believers had been forced underground, and it was dangerous to lay claim to being a Christian. There were secret meetings and vocabulary and gestures and symbols. Christianity was practiced, if you will, in the shadows, in secret. People were afraid for their lives, their family members' lives, and their livelihoods. When the Gospel of John was probably written, it was a dangerous time to be a Christian. Both the Romans and the Jews wanted to identify believers and eradicate them as early as possible. So, even though the wisdom lesson literally appears early in Jesus' ministry and the early part of the gospel, the passage was probably penned during a time of severe oppression. I think that it is important to realize that when John places this wisdom lesson saying, on Jesus' lips, it was a bold and even radical statement about this new faith and how it should be practiced. It was a radical call to discipleship, to not do things in secret, and to not be afraid of the light of public scrutiny about these early Christians and what they believed and what they did, even in the face of overt, aggressive, and hostile activity by rulers and others in society. It certainly was a radical and probably a controversial idea that nothing is or should be hidden, and that these early ideas, these actions, and these beliefs could withstand the light of day and full public scrutiny and transparency. Early believers would have serious pushback, of course, I'm sure. The wisdom saying for today is a clear call for followers to be bold, to claim the truth with a capital T, and to not be afraid of making public the claims of this nascent faith. Now, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees. And I'm going to read this passage here, but I want to put in a little bit of context. And the name of the person was Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a member of the Jewish ruling party. Jesus told him about being born again, about being in the Spirit and not in the flesh. He spoke of heavenly things. And in these very few passages that just come prior to the wisdom lesson, we have the very famous saying that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believed in him should not perish but have eternal life. These passages in John are fundamental teachings in Christianity, perhaps from Jesus himself, but most certainly from his followers. The ideas and the sayings, all of which found their way into orthodoxy and into Christian orthodoxy. Of importance, once you read these familiar passages, is what Jesus concludes his teaching with, and that's the wisdom lesson today. I think that this one passage is very important in John 3:19. And the following are important because they provide a valuable context for what developed into Christian orthodoxy. So Jesus concludes his comments to Nicodemus with this summation. John 3:19. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear of their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. Now, have you ever walked into a totally dark room where you can't even see the hand in front of your face? Have you ever done that? And then after a while, your eyes start to become accustomed to the light, and you're able to see things in the room a bit more clearly, and perhaps not with absolute clarity, but you can start to pick out objects and people and things around you. Anybody ever had that experience? I think most of us have. After a short while, things in the dark space become pretty clear, or at least clearer. And after a while, it becomes normal to be in that dark space. People can then move around and people can read words, and then certainly after a while it becomes kind of a normal way of being in that dark. When I was in the parish, we had an evening worship service during Lent, and I don't know if you're aware of it. We're in the fourth Sunday in Lent right now. And I turned out all the lights. We were in total darkness. Initially, we couldn't see hands in front of our faces. After spending some time in the dark room, however, we could function fairly well. We could eventually discern the things and the people around us, and we could even make our way around the sanctuary. The ushers could navigate up and down the aisles. The choir could see the choir director, and the organist could see the keyboard and play some soft music. We sat quietly for a few minutes, letting our eyes adjust to the darkness. As our eyes began to adjust, I talked about being in the darkness and how over time we often become accustomed to being in the dark. I recall telling the congregation that after a while it becomes our new normal. Sure enough, that's what happened. We could see, albeit not very clearly, but we could see. Then dramatically and without notice, I turned all the lights on, and people covered their eyes. Many groaned and winced. In a flash, things were not very clear or totally visible, but now they were starting to become that way quickly. It was very easy to start to see once the lights came on. There were a few minutes of adjustment, and in some cases some discomfort, but for the most part, people did adjust. Now, I had these three observations that I shared with the congregation. First, it was interesting how we could get used to being in the dark and how quickly that could happen, and how those in the shadows became normal and at a level very comfortable. We accepted the diminished light, the shadows, and the lack of clarity. We could function, we adapted, and we adjusted. In fact, we might, had we had enough time, even started to believe that this darkness with its grays and the shadows were the way things are supposed to be. Secondly, when the lights came on, There was an initial period of discomfort, and then thirdly, it took a bit of time to readjust our sight and perspective, but in the end, most people preferred living in the light and not in the darkness. So those are my 3 points when I did this experiment with this congregation. Our government today seems to enjoy living in the dark and often operating in the dark. Now, how many would support that kind of general idea? We often hear about what the president is doing or thinking in his distorted reality in this dark place through his tweets and his attempts to cast blame and offer alternative facts and make outright lies. When the light shines in the darkness, as of yet, he, his administration, and the Republican Party seem still to prefer the darkness to the light and seem to obfuscate the reality by creating confusion and distortion. At least that's my perspective. Of late, apparently those in power have felt it is within their purview to ignore the Sunshine Law of 1976, which reinforces the need for transparency. This was a law that was intended to make sure that the light shines on all government transactions. 1976 is when that was enacted into law. There have been some very recent notable occurrences that are occurring in our government that, in my mind, clearly ignore the law or intentionally are meant to keep the public in the dark. Now, here's some events just to refresh your memory, and I won't be too terribly long with a lot of these, but you know them. I'm just trying to get you up to speed here. Remember that the president has contacted President Putin now 8 times, at least 8 times, and our media and therefore the American public only heard about these phone calls and meetings through the Russian press, because our citizens were not told of the meetings or the context of the content. Now, this is not transparency, folks. This is darkness. Amen. Recall Glenn Simpson. He is the owner of Fusion GPS, a political research firm. He testified for 21 hours before 3 congressional committees about the dossier penned by Christopher Steele, a former British intel officer specializing in Russia. The contents of the testimony only came out and into the light because Senator Dianne Feinstein preempted her committee and released the transcripts. Her Senate Republicans colleagues refused to release the transcripts despite the fact that Simpson and the Democrats asked that the testimony be released. What were the Republicans trying to hide? Why did they want to hide and keep this all in the dark? Was it what the wisdom lesson suggests, to create a cover for their evil deeds? Fortunately, Senator Feinstein understands and understood what shining the light in the darkness meant. Well, let's not forget the tax cuts and the Job Acts of 2017. All those events took place in the dark. There was no input from Democrats. There was no public testimony. There was no public comments. And the votes to enact this massive consequential legislation passed only along party lines, 51 to 48, with virtually no time for a full reading of the document, which is quite long, no debate and no discussion. Where was the transparency? Why did they feel it was good to sculpt this massive legislation in the dark and keep it hidden until just hours before the vote? Has darkness become the new normal? What about all the repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act meetings? The Democrats were shut out there. No public comment, no expert witnesses, no input. Why the secrecy? Why the darkness? Now, this short list does not even address the dozens of instances when the Trump and the administration official were caught lying or having lied, and it was made public, and wasn't made public until the light was shown on their lies. Thanks to the free press, the Sunshine Law, and some people of conscience, they seemed to get the information We seem to get the information, albeit in dribble and drabs. Now just take a moment and think about some of the other actors in this play. And I don't need to rehearse, and I won't rehearse all the names. You know the names. And it is as if this new darkness, or this darkness, has become the new normal. I'm struck by what Steve Bannon has said. Darkness is good. Dick Cheney, Darth Vader, Satan. That's power. Now think about that a minute. He advised the president. And I suppose that if you're more into power and darkness and obfuscation and opaqueness and confusion, and these are the key elements of your thinking and your worldview, then perhaps there's no wonder there's problems. Certainly, in my view, this is not what our founding fathers would have wanted. When our country was being born and when the founders put together the Constitution, the Federalist Papers were written specifically as talking points and commentary and arguments as to the reasoning and rationale for including one idea over another. Even though the initial specific language of the Constitution was done in secret, the Federalist Papers revealed what was written and why it was written. There was then a lot of public discussion about that. Federalist number 49, the people are the only legitimate foundation of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter is derived. Government is and should be the servant of the people, and it should be fully accountable to them for the actions which it supposedly takes on their behalf. In other words, in order for our form of government to function the way it's supposed to function, the governed must be able to see what those who govern are doing and know the reasons why they're doing and saying the things that are said and done. The citizenry is not to be left in the dark, and the government actions are supposed to be out in the open and subject to the light of scrutiny. Now, why is this? When the light shines in dark places and in dark actions, there is truth. There is reality. There are no alternative facts or fake news. To live in the darkness distorts reality, shades the truth, corrupts the facts, hides the actions and intentions. As Jesus admonished early followers, and as his words challenge us even today, we should not be afraid of the light. We need to come out of the dark. We need to not hide what we do or what we say or what we believe. What Jesus said and did was not evil, although some, like those in the government and religious and social leadership, thought it was. What Jesus did, like feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, being with those who are sick, being with those in prison, and those who are oppressed or on the margins. He loved the unlovable, welcomed the stranger. He was kind and generous and caring, all of which could stand up to scrutiny, which, by the way, it has for 2,000 years. There was and there is no current need for Jesus' story, his actions, his words, to be hidden away or in the dark. They can and should come out into the light, for they're not evil but good. Let the light shine and do not be afraid or keep it hidden away, is what he was saying. If this was only the mindset of our current politicos. Now, frankly, it is very easy and at a level even seductive and certainly compelling to point fingers at others, especially our current government and those who live in the public arena, those in Hollywood and business and religious organizations, to call them out, to shine light on their misdeeds, to point out the darkness in which they live, to watch them squirm and listen to those late-night TV show hosts that make fun of them and their fear of the light and exposure. That's seductive. That's fun to do, isn't it? Christ. We all kind of get a joy out of that. And yet, when it comes to shining light in our own darkness, perhaps we're not as ready to turn on the light. Who here enjoys mucking around in the deepest, darkest, most secret places of your inner psyche? Anybody really enjoy that? No hands there. Like Dr. Ray, I have a background in counseling, and I was a licensed marriage and family therapist for a number of years. I recall one young lady who came into my office and said to me she was very sad all the time. She couldn't seem to shake her sadness. She said, all I want to do is be happy again. She asked me to help her feel happy. I told her up front that in order to do this, we might need to take a look at what Freud labeled as the inner world of her subconscious and unconscious. Typically, most people are initially pretty willing to go deep until they actually do go deep. Within a matter of weeks, most people find all sorts of reasons not to come back for their appointments or to be honest with their feelings or their thoughts or actions. But this gal was a little bit different. She went deep. Brought out into the light during our time together were early childhood sexual abuse and later young adult sexual exploitation. She had buried these traumas in her body and in her psyche in the deep and dark recesses of her mind. This allowed her to not have to recall them, or for that matter, deal with them. And although this revelation of her hidden past, which certainly predated the Me Too movement, clearly revealed these past traumas and had a huge and pervasive impact on this young woman's life and relationships, it took a long time. But by shining light into the darkness, this woman was able to heal and find the happiness and joy that she sought. Shining light into the darkness was hard, but it was worth it for her. At a level, this is all that therapy is, by the way. It is simply shining light into the darkness. I marvel at those people who willingly and knowingly dive into their own deep, dark parts and shine light in those deep, dark corners of their psyche and expose those experiences of alienation from self and from others. It takes real courage to shine light into the darkness, both personal and corporate. And I think this is what Jesus was talking about. Not being afraid to shine light in the darkness and having the courage to shine light into that darkness. Now, others have said similar things. Carl Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, making darkness conscious, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. He also said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, said, knowing others is wisdom, knowing yourself is enlightenment. And the Buddha is purported to have said, to enjoy good health, to bring true happiness to one's family, to bring peace to all, one must first discipline and control one's own mind. If a person can control the mind, he or she can find the way to enlightenment, and all wisdom and virtue will naturally come to him. Now, many of you have heard of Kevin Bacon. He is an actor, he's a musician. He starred in Footloose and Apollo 13, Flatliners, and Mystic River. Many of you have probably seen these films. Now, you wouldn't expect him to be a philosopher. One of the things I've noticed about really creative people, and that is that they oftentimes go deep and into their own darknesses, and oftentimes emerge with some wonderful insights. Well, this is what Kevin Bacon has to say about darkness. He said, "I really believe that all of us have a lot of darkness in our souls. Anger, rage, fear, sadness. I don't think that's only reserved for people who have horrible upbringings. I think it really exists and is part of the human condition. I think in the course of your life, you figure out ways to deal with that." Now, how many of us are willing and consciously want to deal with the stuff that finds a comfortable living place in the private, secret, and occasionally threatening places of our inner selves that rarely, if ever, sees the light of day? How many of us are afraid of the light being shown into our own inner darkness? For many of us, it is because of what Jesus had to say in John 3:19. We're afraid of the light shining on our evil deeds. Or perhaps, and probably more likely, we're afraid of being judged. Or we might need to change. Or we might need to apologize or be honest, or we might have to deal with the circumstances of our past or the consequences of our present thinking and actions. Perhaps it is not because our deeds are or were necessarily evil, even though evil deeds might give us a clue as to that there might be something deep down there in our inner darkness. Perhaps that's not the reason, but because by going into the dark places, it might uncover that which has been buried or hidden or suppressed, or for which we might be ashamed or feel guilty. Perhaps we might need to reframe our reality or be honest about who we are or what we've become. Or perhaps we might have to deal with the lies others have told us about ourselves that have been hurtful or destructive, and that we have come to believe are truth about ourselves. Regardless, wandering into our own dark places, shining light in the darkness, being open and transparent, all demand courage. We, as people of faith, are called to have courage. We are called to be in the light and shine light in the darkness. So, what is your dark place? If Kevin Bacon is correct, all of us have dark places. If this is true, then my bet is that all of us have those parts of our inner self that could benefit from a little exposure from the light. It might be hard, it might be dangerous, but perhaps it is necessary. It is necessary to grow. It is necessary to not be afraid. Now, Mother Teresa said, "Honesty and transparency make you vulnerable. Be honest and transparent anyway." Now, I'm not asking you to share your darkness with this congregation right now. Some of you are saying, "Whew, that's good news." Perhaps you're depressed or resentful or feeling rage or anger or fear of failing. There might be something in the dark recesses of your soul that is causing these feelings. Perhaps you might feel unimportant, small or less than, inadequate or ugly. Perhaps you might feel a need to be controlling. Perhaps you're bitter, shame-filled, or feeling guilty. Perhaps you listen to your internal criticizer that constantly tells you you're no damn good, that you're not important, that you are worthless, and you've replaced your internal critic with your internal criticizer. Perhaps you have addictions or compulsions or obsessions or post-traumatic stress disorder or suicidal thoughts or sorrow or loneliness, grief or despair, whatever it is. These might indicate that you're laboring in the darkness. And by laboring in the darkness, it keeps you from being happy, joy-filled, peaceful, and healthy. Now, frankly, some people enjoy the darkness. You probably know some folks that enjoy being in the dark. They enjoy living in it. They enjoy spreading that darkness wherever they go. You might know people like that. Perhaps they have found that darkness has become the new normal for them. And the fear of the light is so great that it will expose who they really are, and as a result, others won't like them or even love them. They grow accustomed to being in the darkness. They like it, they wallow in it. In the end, however, living in the darkness and with the darkness only deepens the darkness and pushes away others and causes divisiveness and hostility towards others and self. Plato said, "We can easily forgive a child who's afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when adults are afraid of the light." How many of us are willing and perhaps brave enough to turn the light on and expose the darkness in our own lives? We do it readily to others, but what about ourselves? I like what Muhammad Ali said, that charismatic prize fighter, that cultural critic. He said this: "A rooster crows only when he sees light. Put him in the dark and he'll never crow. I have seen the light and I'm crowing." That would be him, wouldn't it? And is that you? The challenge this week is to lobby and to be active in demanding government transparency. We can do that individually and we can do that collectively. Also, and perhaps even more importantly, is to take time and shine light on the darkness of your own thinking. The discovery of the true self demands transparency and light being shown into our internal darkness so that we can move forwards and towards wholeness and healthiness. Now, I don't know if it was Eleanor Roosevelt or Confucius or perhaps it was John F. Kennedy who said, I really don't know for sure, but this saying is right on the money for our government and for ourselves. It is better to shine a candle, better to light a candle than curse the darkness. Have courage, light the candle, shine light into that darkness.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.